With the help of local governors, internal uprisings were quickly suppressed. Tiglath-Pileser III ascended the throne on the 13th day of Iyar, which is believed to be in April or May. By Tishrit, likely September or October, he was already leading the army on a campaign against the Chaldean principalities in southern Mesopotamia. The army advanced by crushing the nomadic tribes in the area and reached the Persian Gulf without touching the cities of Babylon. The Chaldeans in the region were quickly defeated in short battles. During this campaign, Tiglath-Pileser traveled from Sippar to Uruk, stopping at the sacred temples in Babylon, Borsippa, and Kuta, to show that he was the natural protector of these holy sites. The priests in these cities welcomed him with grand ceremonies. By doing this, he also wanted to show that he was the protector of the Babylonian throne, which had been under the rule of Nabonassar for the past 3 years. In his second year of rule, Tiglath-Pileser launched a campaign into the Zagros Mountains. Different areas of the mountain range were occupied. Fear spread to the surrounding regions, and the army returned with large amounts of plunder. The third campaign was launched to solve the Syrian problem. As mentioned earlier, Mati-Il, the king of Bit Agusi, had broken his agreement with Ashur-Nirari and later formed an alliance with other Syrian kingdoms against Assyria. This alliance was also supported by Sardur III, the king of Urartu. The Urartian allied states of Melidu, Urgum, Kumuhu, modern-day Cilicia, and the kingdom of Chukurova were also part of this regional coalition. An inscription found near Aleppo mentions the unification of Upper and Lower Aram, indicating that all of Aram had come together under a single front. In 743 BC, Tiglath-Pileser III led a powerful army toward Arpad, the capital of the Bit Agusi alliance. However, before reaching the Euphrates, the Assyrian army encountered the Urartian army. Sardur wanted to prevent the Assyrians from advancing into northern Syria and aimed to establish Urartian dominance in the region. The two armies clashed near present-day Birachik. The Urartians were unable to withstand the superior size and advanced tactics of the Assyrian army. Sardur retreated with the remaining parts of his army toward Anatolia. Tiglath-Pileser did not pursue the retreating Urartians, but continued toward his main target, Arpad. The siege of Arpad lasted from 742 to 740 BC, 2 long years. During this period, Assyrian forces captured the region between Hama and the Amanos Mountains. However, the people of Arpad held out against the siege. When Arpad finally fell after 2 years, the news shook all of Syria. The kings of Carchemish, Damascus, Tyre, and Gurgum came to Arpad to declare their loyalty to Tiglath-Pileser and offer tribute. However, this victory did not yet establish full Assyrian dominance over Syria. The following year, while the Assyrian army was campaigning in the Taurus Mountains, a new alliance formed in Syria to resist Assyrian control. This time, the king of Samal, near the Gulf of Issos, led the coalition. In 738 BC, he launched a swift and decisive campaign against the United Kingdoms. He destroyed the kingdoms of Hama and Samal and incorporated them into the newly organized Assyrian provincial system. As a result, the kingdoms of Damascus, Samaria, Tyre, Byblos, Carchemish, Hama, Samal, Gurgum, and Casca were now under Assyrian control. Even distant regions began to feel the reach of Assyrian power. The chiefs of Tabal in Anatolia and Queen Zabiba of the Arabs also submitted and began paying tribute to Assyria. Tiglath-Pileser redrew the political map of Syria for his own benefit. He turned his attention to the Zagros Mountains and eastern Anatolia. Indeed, the years between 737 and 735 BC were marked by Assyrian raids on the Urartians and the Medes. The first campaign was a raid led by the governor of Mazamua with his provincial army. After this campaign against the Median tribes, several Median tribes were forced to pay tribute. After this campaign, the Assyrians realized the large number of the Medes and the vast size of their territory. From that point on, the Assyrian inscriptions began referring to the land where the Median tribes lived as the land of the Medes, or Media. During this campaign, the Assyrian troops advanced to the foothills of the Demavend mountain, where present-day Tehran is located. Along with taxing the Medes, the Assyrians captured 5,000 horses and 65,000 Median nomads. These Medes were later relocated to the Diyala region. The following year, Tiglath-Pileser led an Assyrian army northward to the region between Lake Van and the upper Euphrates. The goal of this campaign was to deliver a heavy blow to the Urartians and bring about their downfall. The Assyrian army marched 600 kilometers, burning villages and towns in its path, and captured the fortresses in the southern part of the Urartian kingdom. Aramean families from Shamal were settled in these fortresses. Strong Assyrian forces were assigned to the commanders of these fortresses to maintain control over the conquered territories. This secured the northern borders and ensured the collection of taxes from the region. In 735 BC, the Assyrians besieged the Urartian capital, Tushpa. However, due to strong Urartian resistance, the siege was lifted after a while. By the end of these campaigns, the southern part of the Urartian kingdom was under Assyrian control, creating a security buffer against future Urartian attacks on Syria and Assyria. In the following years, Tiglath-Pileser turned his attention toward Syria. The kings of Shamal and Israel, Panamuya and Menahem, had accepted Assyrian dominance, but the cities of Damascus, Samaria, Ashkelon, and Gaza had stopped paying tribute. The Phoenician city-states of Tyre and Sidon also stopped paying tribute after Assyrian restrictions on their trade with Egypt. To resolve these issues, Tiglath-Pileser launched a campaign in Palestine in 734 BC. During this campaign, he captured rebellious Phoenician cities, including Byblos, and divided the region into 6 military districts. He annexed part of the kingdom of Damascus to Assyria and eventually captured and plundered Gaza. The king of Gaza, Hanno, fled to Egypt. While Tiglath-Pileser was in Gaza, the king of Judah, Ahaz, sent envoys asking for his help. Israeli and Syrian troops were raiding Judah's lands and plundering the property of the villagers. Tiglath-Pileser punished Israel by exiling its people and put Hosea, who was loyal to him, on the throne of Israel. In Anatolia, the king of Tabal, established by the Luwians, rebelled, but the Assyrian army sent to suppress the rebellion was defeated. Tiglath-Pileser removed the rebel king and replaced him with a loyal noble. In Arabia, Tiglath-Pileser sent a military advisor to the palace of Queen Samsi. Besides paying tribute, the queen also agreed to send 10,000 Arab warriors for future Assyrian campaigns. Thus, 732 BC became a year when the number of Assyria's vassal states increased. The campaigns against Syria and Palestine had subdued the kingdoms and people in those regions. In the later years of Tiglath-Pileser's reign, no significant changes occurred in these areas. The next target was the southern part of Mesopotamia. The king of Babylon, Nabonassar, died in 734 BC, and his son, Nadanu, took the throne. In the second year of his reign, Nadinu was killed by a military commander named Nabushum-Ukin. 2 months later, Ukin-Zer, a noble from the Chaldean Bit Amukani tribe, eliminated Nabu-shum-ukin, and took the throne. Like other Assyrian kings, Tiglath-Pileser was opposed to the Aramean origin Chaldeans, but Ukin-Zer was not the only one to be punished. The southern Aramean tribes and small kingdoms also had to be forced to pay tribute and brought under Assyrian control to restore the balance of power in the region. The chaos in Babylon worried Tiglath-Pileser III, who wanted to maintain his authority over the region. He led his army to Babylon, intending to discipline not only the Bit Amukani tribe, but also any Aramean tribe causing trouble or likely to do so. The Assyrian army first fought the Pukudu tribe and defeated them, annexing their territory into the Arafah province. Next, Tiglath-Pileser attacked the Bit Silani and Bit Sa'ali tribes. Their leaders and nobles were killed or captured, farmland was burned, and settlements were destroyed. Around 120,000 villagers were forcibly relocated to the inner regions. Ukin-Zer, the new king of Babylon, resisted from the city of Shapia for a long time. Eventually the city fell, and Ukin-Zer was captured. After the defeat of the Bit Amukani tribe, the other Aramean tribes surrendered. The leader of the Bit Yakin tribe and the ruler of the Basra Gulf region, Marduk Apla Idina, brought valuable gifts to Shapia, paid his tribute, and declared his loyalty to Tiglath-Pileser. Thus, the Assyrian peace was established in southern Mesopotamia, and the region accepted Assyrian dominance. This raised the question of what Babylon's future would be. Tiglath-Pileser did not want to lose control of Babylon, but he also did not want to turn this sacred land, full of important Mesopotamian cultural centers, into a regular Assyrian province. Tiglath-Pileser found a solution. He maintained Babylon's internal independence while ensuring it remained under Assyrian control externally. To formalize this arrangement, he assumed the titles of King of Babylon and King of Sumer and Akkad. To reinforce this connection, he adopted the Babylonian throne name Pulu. To further establish his authority, Tiglath-Pileser personally led the Marduk ritual as the King of Babylon in 729 BC and 728 BC, and initiated the New Year festival. Thus, all of Mesopotamia came under Assyrian control. When he died in 727 BC, he left behind the foundations of an empire for future Assyrian kings. When Tiglath-Pileser took the throne, the country was in a weakened state. The central administration was fragile, and threats from within and outside the kingdom were serious. Internally, the Assyrian people and other groups were restless, while externally, the Arameans, Urartians, and the Neo-Hittite kingdom posed a threat. To stabilize the situation, Tiglath-Pileser needed to crush internal revolts, respond to external threats, and secure new sources of raw materials through conquests and tribute. Tiglath-Pileser first focused on reforming the military. Under his leadership, the Assyrian army was transformed from a force of raiders into a professional and organized army capable of sustained warfare. The core of the army consisted of elite guard units, while the strike force included many foreign troops. Military technology also advanced during Tiglath-Pileser's reign. War chariots were enlarged to accommodate 4 soldiers, and their wheels were increased from 2 to 4 to carry more weight and supplies. Cavalry units were expanded, and infantry troops were protected by improved archers, slingers, and spear throwers. The Assyrian army, which was previously focused on raids and quick strikes, gained the capability to lay long-term sieges. The technical infrastructure needed to sustain such sieges was developed. After a city was captured, measures were taken to secure control. Houses were built for military and civil officials, and barracks and warehouses were established for the troops. The army also had a dedicated communication system. Tiglath-Pileser was not just a military leader. He also acted as the army's chief strategist, coordinating movements and providing logistical support. Tiglath-Pileser's reforms extended beyond the military to the political and administrative structure of the empire. Newly conquered territories were incorporated into the empire as provinces, directly linked to the central government. Governors and tax officials were appointed to manage these provinces, and permanent military garrisons were stationed there. Tiglath-Pileser's strategy of expansion and hegemony can be summarized as follows. He would first intimidate neighboring countries, then bring them under Assyrian influence, and eventually incorporate them into the empire. In some cases, regions under Assyrian influence were classified as part of the external regions administration, rather than fully annexed territories. This approach prevented local populations from seeing themselves as occupied, reducing the likelihood of rebellion. There were also vassal kingdoms that regularly paid tribute. In these cases, Tiglath-Pileser would place a loyal noble on the throne of the conquered kingdom. These vassal states not only paid tribute, but were also required to provide troops for the Assyrian army during wartime. Assyrian military and civil experts were stationed in these regions to support the local rulers and maintain Assyrian influence. The traditional deportations of the Assyrian rulers increased in parallel with the rise in the number of regions they controlled during this period. The people of the occupied regions were deported to foreign lands, and by uprooting these people, their independence struggles were prevented and weakened. As a result of this policy, 30,000 Arameans from the Hama region were deported to the Zagros Mountains. 150,000 Chaldeans were deported from southern Mesopotamia to the north and northeast, and 50,000 war prisoners from Iran were sent to southern Mesopotamia. In the conquered regions, fortresses and military garrisons were established. Assyrians settled in the neighborhoods built around these garrisons, trying to make the Assyrians and Assyrian rule take root in the region. The Assyrians respected the local people's beliefs and traditions, preferring to settle peacefully rather than by force and oppression. Despite this, the people in the conquered regions often rebelled and tried to shake off Assyrian rule. After the death of Tiglath-Pileser, his son Shalmaneser V took the throne, but his reign was short. Shalmaneser marched against the rebellious Israelite king Hosea and, after a long siege, captured the capital Samaria. According to later records, the Cilicia region was also annexed to Assyria during his reign. Shalmaneser also abolished the tax exemption rights of the Assyrian and Haran people, which made him unpopular among his own people, as the Assyrians and Arameans had not been paying taxes for a long time. When Sargon II ascended the throne in the month of Tebet in 722 BC, he had to deal with a troubled legacy both internally and externally. The Elamites, Egypt, and the Urartu kingdom were preparing for an attack. The principalities in Syria were uniting against Assyrian rule, and Babylon was in turmoil. To prevent the Babylonian crown from being lost, Sargon first signed a treaty with the Chaldean king Marduk-apla-iddina. Then he abolished the taxes imposed on the Assyrian and Aramean people, restored their former tax exemptions, and also granted them privileges in customs and port duties. However, Marduk-apla-iddina used the treaty for his own benefit and seized the city of Babylon in 721 BC, where he was crowned and sat on the Babylonian throne. He was supported by the Elamites, who were regaining strength and wanted to show their power. In Syria, King Ilu-Ibidi of Hama, together with King Hanuna of Gaza, formed a front against Assyrian dominance, which was supported by the Egyptians. Sargon II waged war on two fronts in 720 BC against his enemies. One Assyrian army marched against the Elamites to prevent aid from reaching Babylon. However, the Elamite army under King Umanigash repelled the Assyrians near Dare. As a result, Marduk-apla-iddina secured the Babylonian throne. Later that year, towards the end of summer, Sargon led the Assyrian army and defeated the Syrian front's army near Karkar. After this battle, the kingdoms of Arpad, Simira, and Damascus once again came under Assyrian control. Then Sargon marched to Gaza, captured the city, scattered the Egyptian forces that had come to help, and established a military garrison at Raphia on the Egyptian border. On his way back, he stopped in Samaria, reorganized the city's administration, and made it the capital of the newly established province of Samarina. Thus, the necessary reforms within Assyria were implemented, and the Syrian and Babylonian problems were resolved, one favorably and the other unfavorably. Sargon then decided to march on the Urartu kingdom, which posed a significant threat. The Urartu kingdom had suffered heavy defeats under Tiglath-Pileser, but the Urartians had recovered and regained their strength. King Rusa, who ascended the throne in 730 BC, had raided the Caucasus, fought the Medes, subdued them, and forced local chiefs and tribes to pay tribute, strengthening his kingdom. Rusa also built several roads, bridges, inns, and dams within the kingdom. The lake known today as Lake Keshish was formed by a dam constructed during his reign. Additionally, the capital was moved from Van to Toprakale under his rule. Rusa sought to conquer the territory of the Manaeans, who were under the protection of the Assyrians. The Urartians and the king of Zikitu, Mitati, attempted to instigate a rebellion in the Manaean kingdom. When Manaean king Iranzu requested help from the Assyrians to suppress the rebellion, Sargon marched to the kingdom he protected in 719 BC. After quelling the rebellion, the Assyrian army advanced toward the kingdom of Tabal in western Anatolia. Sargon replaced the opposing king of this kingdom with a new one. The new king strengthened ties with Sargon by giving one of his daughters in marriage. The kingdom of Carchemish, located on the strategic route along the Euphrates to Anatolia, had established secret ties with Phrygian king Midas. The Assyrian army marched on Carchemish, captured the region, and removed the king from power. An Assyrian governor was appointed to rule the city, and a military garrison was established there. The years 718 and 717 BC marked Sargon's campaigns into eastern Anatolia and the Zagros Mountains. After these campaigns, settlements in the region were destroyed and replaced with new ones. These newly founded Assyrian cities were given Assyrian names such as Kar-Nabu, Kar-Sin, Kar-Adad, and Kar-Ishtar. They were also reinforced with military garrisons. During these years, the eastern part of Assyria had fallen under the control of the Median tribes. The Medes had settled in much of the Zagros Mountains and the Iranian plains. Undoubtedly, Sargon had not yet seen the threat from the Medes. The Medes, who had settled in many places, had begun to establish cities such as Harhar, Kindau, and Kishesim. In 707 BC, Sargon returned with part of the Babylonian treasures and moved to the new capital, Dur-Sharrukin, modern Khorsabad. The decision to move the capital from Kalhu and establish a new capital had been made 10 years earlier. The palace was built 16 kilometers south of Nineveh. Its 2.5-kilometer-long walls were decorated with reliefs depicting hunting and battle scenes, with human-headed bulls guarding the entrance gates. The palace halls were covered with reliefs, showing Sargon fighting in enemy cities and lands. The scent from the beams on the ceilings and the doors made of cedar and rosewood filled the rooms, captivating visitors. A new ziggurat was built near the palace, dedicated to 6 major gods: Ea, Shamash, Nabu, Adad, Ninurta, and their consorts. A large number of priests were responsible for offering continuous sacrifices and gifts to the magnificent statues representing these gods in the temple, which had walls made of colorful bricks. Dur-Sharrukin was surrounded by 8 kilometers of walls, with 8 large gates providing access to the city. This length corresponded to 16,280 Assyrian cubits, a symbolic reference to the king's name. The working population of the city consisted of war prisoners and people deported from conquered territories, representing various ethnic groups. By bringing together people speaking different languages and from different ethnic backgrounds, Sargon aimed to dissolve their identities and prevent them from engaging in political activities. Additionally, security forces and priests were tasked with teaching these forced migrants Assyrian traditions and beliefs. When Sargon II died in 705 BC, he left his son Sennacherib a wealthy empire filled with gold and precious stones acquired through taxes, war spoils, and the labor of the working population. Sennacherib was an experienced ruler who understood both state administration and foreign policy. However, rebellions broke out as soon as he ascended the throne. Sennacherib responded to these uprisings with harsh measures, crushing the rebellious masses and executing their leaders. Afterward, he imposed heavy pressure on non-Assyrian ethnic groups. Sargon's conquests and the expansion of the Assyrian Empire had turned Assyria into a prison of nations. Egypt, Urartu, and Elam, neighboring states that felt the growing threat from Assyria, were secretly supporting the internal uprisings within the empire. Moreover, the policy of relocating conquered populations into Assyrian territory and settling Assyrians in border cities and fortresses had weakened Assyrian identity. The Assyrian people had blended with other ethnic groups, becoming part of the oppressed majority. For the Assyrians, being Assyrian or not had become meaningless. The oppressive rule of the absolute monarchy weighed equally on all peoples. From our perspective, the intense nationalist pressures imposed on non-Assyrian groups during Sennacherib's reign aimed at fostering a sense of Assyrian nationalism. Of course, the concept of nationalism at that time was not the same as its modern meaning. It was simply a way to differentiate between Assyrians and non-Assyrians. The ruling class, consisting of the king, the wealthy palace elites, bureaucrats, and priests, sought to reduce social tensions by elevating the status of the Assyrians over other ethnic groups. Sennacherib's goal was to create a dominant ethnic group or nation to prevent fragmentation and redirect the focus of public unrest. Shortly after Sargon's death, a Chaldean noble named Marduk-Zakir-Shumi seized the Babylonian throne. However, he was soon overthrown by the former Babylonian king Marduk-Apla-iddina, who reclaimed the Babylonian throne for the second time. He had the support of the entire population and the nomadic tribes of southern Mesopotamia. The Elamites also continued to back Marduk-Apla-iddina, as they had done before. In response to this development, Sennacherib took command of his forces and marched toward Babylon. He laid siege to Kuta, which lay on the road to Babylon, while sending the rest of his army to fight the Babylonian Elamite allied forces near Kish. Kuta's fortress fell quickly, and Sennacherib rushed to support his soldiers engaged in the battle at Kish. The Assyrian forces defeated the Babylonian Elamite allied army, forcing Marduk-Apla-iddina to flee the throne once again. After this victory, Sennacherib placed Bel-Ibni, a Babylonian noble raised in the Assyrian court, on the throne of Babylon. The Assyrian army then crushed the rebellious nomadic tribes. The army returned with rich spoils seized from the Babylonian palace. The Babylonians continued to resist Assyrian rule. During this time, the Babylonian people crowned the Chaldean noble Mushashib-Marduk as king of Babylon. Mushashib-Marduk used gifts and diplomacy to unite some tribes from the Zagros Mountains and various Aramean and Chaldean tribes, forming a united front against the Assyrian threat. The main striking force of this alliance was the Elamite army. Near the Tigris River, close to modern-day Samarra, two armies faced each other. In this bloody battle of chariots, mounted warriors, and archers, the Assyrian army was defeated. But the allied forces also suffered heavy losses. Thousands of soldiers and nomadic warriors were killed, and the Elamite commander also died. It took 2 years for Sennacherib to recover from the wounds of war. In the early summer of 689 BC, the Elamite king suffered a stroke. Taking advantage of the king's illness, Sennacherib marched on Babylon. Using battering rams and ladders, Babylon was captured. We can understand how Babylon was destroyed and how its people were slaughtered from the words of an inscription written after Sennacherib's destruction. I filled the city squares with the bodies of slaughtered people. I burned and destroyed the city and its houses. I tore them down from foundation to roof. I completely destroyed the brick temples, the ziggurats, and the gods. I dug canals from the Euphrates into the center of the city and flooded Babylon so that no one in the future would be able to find the city, the temples, or the gods. I destroyed everything and wiped it out. Sennacherib had avenged his son, who had been killed by the Elamite king. Before this, even the harshest Assyrian kings had never harmed Babylon and its people. Babylon, Borsippa, and Kish were sacred cities of Mesopotamia. The protector gods of these cities, Marduk and Nabu, were also worshipped in Assyria. So why did Sennacherib destroy this sacred city, its people, priests, and temples? Sennacherib had several reasons for this destruction. First, Babylon was a symbol and center of freedom for the southern Mesopotamian peoples against Assyrian domination. Babylon led all the rebellions in the region. Additionally, Babylonian priests and prophets, whose prophets had declined under Assyrian rule, often organized these rebellions and helped the rebels. The gold distributed by the Chaldean Mushashib-Marduk to establish the last united front had come from the temples of Marduk. The main reason for Sennacherib's rage was not just avenging his son, but also destroying the region's desire for freedom. During Sennacherib's reign, a sense of ethnic superiority began among the Assyrians. Sennacherib's policies, which gave privileges to the Assyrian people, strengthened Assyrian identity and caused them to look down on the values of other ethnic groups. This led to Assyrian soldiers breaking religious statues and destroying the cultural symbols of other peoples. Sennacherib's policy is reflected in the Assyrian soldiers' destruction of superior cultures and slaughter of the people who created them. On the other hand, the assassination of the crown prince caused chaos in the Assyrian palace. According to Assyrian tradition, the eldest son of the king would inherit the throne after the king's death. If the eldest son died, the king had to choose another heir from his other sons. Sennacherib had 5 sons, and the youngest was Esarhaddon. As mentioned earlier, Sennacherib's last wife was Princess Nakiah, the daughter of a noblewoman from Babylon. Esarhaddon was Nakiah's son. In Assyria, this queen was known as Zakatu, and she wanted to secure power by placing her son on the throne. However, Sennacherib's other sons were supported by the wealthy Assyrian elite and priests who opposed the idea of a king whose mother was not of Assyrian origin. During this period of palace intrigue and intense power struggles, no major military campaigns were launched. The kingdom of Tabal in central Anatolia declared its independence. Urartu regained its lost border fortresses. The Egyptian pharaoh Taharka stirred up the Hebrews, and the king of Jerusalem, Hezekiah, rebelled against Assyrian rule. An Assyrian army besieging Jerusalem was decimated by a cholera outbreak. Meanwhile, the son of Marduk-apla-iddina took leadership of the Babylonians in the south and began forming an army. Sennacherib faced the challenge of defending his father's legacy and maintaining the strength of the empire. Internal palace struggles prevented him from focusing on foreign policy. Under Queen Zakatu's influence, Sennacherib declared his youngest son, Esarhaddon, as the crown prince. This decision intensified the palace intrigues. His brothers and their supporters opposed Esarhaddon's appointment. A series of plots and conspiracies dominated palace life. Assyrian priests tried to justify the destruction of Babylon and its sacred temples, but most of the people and some priests opposed it. Those who opposed it believed that a savior would come, Babylon would be rebuilt, and the temples would be restored. Queen Zakatu took advantage of this situation, spreading the belief that her son was the savior with the help of her supporters. His brothers accused Esarhaddon of treason and attacked him. As the conflict escalated, Sennacherib intervened and exiled Esarhaddon to an unknown place near Urfa. However, Esarhaddon remained the crown prince. In 681 BC, while in exile, Esarhaddon received news of his father's assassination. It was likely that Sennacherib was killed by Queen Zakatu's men. Esarhaddon marched to Nineveh with his loyal forces. After 6 weeks of civil war, he defeated his brothers and ascended to the Assyrian throne with a grand ceremony. 2 of his brothers, Adramelech and Sharezer, fled to eastern Anatolia and established the Principality of Vaspurakan, south of Lake Van. Esarhaddon first punished those who had rebelled against him. Many nobles were exiled with their families to remote coastal areas of the country. The wealth and income of the Assyrian elite were confiscated, and their taxes were increased. The ruins of Babylon were cleared, and preparations began to rebuild the city. Esarhaddon also blamed the destruction of Babylon on the Assyrian nobles, clearing his father's name. While rebuilding Babylon's most sacred temple, Esagila, the Assyrian temple of Ishara, was also repaired. By respecting the beliefs of both peoples, Esarhaddon aimed to restore balance among the people. The ban on non-Assyrians entering Assyrian temples was lifted. The previous balance among the various ethnic groups living in Assyria was restored, and the privileges given to the Assyrian people were revoked. While the statues of gods in Esagila were being repaired, the Assyrian god statues were also cleaned and restored. Some of the statues were even returned to Babylon. However, the statue of Marduk would remain in Assyria for many years. Esarhaddon also lifted the ban on trade in Babylon, Borsippa, Nippur, and Sippar, allowing the cities to resume their role as centers of multicultural trade. In the south, nomads had settled on empty fields and were working the land without paying taxes. Esarhaddon launched a campaign in these regions and resolved the issue. After the death of the Elamite king, his brother Urtaki took the throne, improving Assyrian-Elamite relations. The unrest in the southern regions gave way to political stability and peace. The region stretching to the Persian Gulf was now under Assyrian control, known as the Pax Assyriaca, Assyrian peace. However, trouble was brewing in other parts of the empire. The Cimmerians, who had stayed away from Assyrian borders for a long time after plundering the Black Sea coast and destroying the kingdom of Phrygia, reappeared on the Assyrian borders. The Assyrian army defeated the Cimmerians near Hubushana, close to modern Ereğli in Konya. Around the same time, an expedition was launched into the Taurus Mountains. On the return, the Assyrian army besieged the capital of the Malatya Principality, but the king escaped and saved his life. In the same year, Esarhaddon led his army toward northeastern Arabia, subduing the Arab tribes in the region and annexing the land of Bazu, near modern Bahrain, into the Assyrian Empire. During the same year, a campaign into Syria resulted in the appointment of Aramean nobles as the leaders of several local kingdoms. By the end of this campaign, the city-states of Cyprus and the Phoenician principalities were brought back under imperial control. However, an expedition into Egypt in 674 BC ended in defeat. In an eastern campaign in Anatolia, the Assyrians defeated the Mani and their allies, the Scythians. The Guti, Assyria's eastern neighbors, had formed an alliance with the Scythians near the Aral Sea and were raiding the Assyrian border regions. Their goal was to take control of the cattle and horse trade between Urartu and Assyria. Meanwhile, the Medes, who had settled in the Iranian plateau, also posed a threat to Assyrian borders. In 676 BC, the Assyrian army launched a campaign into Iran. Some Median chieftains supported the Assyrians, helping them suppress the Guti, Scythians, and Mani. After this event, the Medes occasionally provided horses to Assyrian tax collectors, ensuring relative peace in the region. The Urartians, on the other hand, were working to strengthen their borders with fortresses while cooperating with the Cimmerians and Scythians against Assyrian expansion. In 672 BC, Esarhaddon's eldest son died, forcing him to choose a new heir. He intended to place his son Shamash-Shum-Ukin on the Babylonian throne and choose one of his two other sons as heir to the Assyrian throne. However, he was uncertain whether to select his middle or youngest son. Esarhaddon was a superstitious and indecisive king, often fearful of the gods' wrath. His mother, Queen Zakatu, essentially managed palace affairs. Esarhaddon frequently sought her advice on important matters. When Zakatu fell ill in 672 BC, the issue of succession became urgent. Esarhaddon appointed Shamash-Shum-Ukin as king of Babylon and named his youngest son, Ashurbanipal, as the heir to the Assyrian throne. This decision faced opposition from priests and nobles who claimed that the young heir lacked experience in state affairs. In response, Ashurbanipal demanded that his legitimacy be confirmed through a ceremony attended by the royal family, nobles, and priests. Esarhaddon personally ensured the ceremony took place and sent official letters to all the kingdoms and provinces of the empire, confirming Ashurbanipal's status as heir. The king's brothers, uncles, nephews, and other relatives made up the elite class of the Assyrian palace. Below them were the nobles, priests, and military commanders who held key positions in the palace and the state. Each wealthy family in the empire had a representative or relative working in the palace, ensuring that their interests were protected. In the provinces, a similar system existed, with local nobles and governors maintaining ties with the palace through family connections. Provincial nobles sent their sons to work with the governors. Similarly, vassal kingdoms were governed in the same way. A powerful elite class of wealthy landowners, nobles, and priests controlled the Assyrian Empire, keeping the population under pressure. The difficulty of governing the empire arose from the cultural and linguistic diversity of the people living under Assyrian rule. The vassal kingdoms also sought to break free from Assyrian control from time to time. Esarhaddon and the conquest of Egypt Esarhaddon had reunited the empire, much like it was during the reign of Sargon II. However, this unity was largely superficial. For instance, the linguistic unity of the empire was maintained through Aramaic, which was the cultural language of Assyria. Religious unity was not based on devotion to the local Assyrian gods, but on the worship of Babylonian gods, especially Marduk. One of the dominant superstitions among the people and the ruling class was astrology, which had spread from Babylon. While astrology suggested that the movements of the stars influenced human life and nature, it also laid the groundwork for the development of astronomy in the future. Babylonian culture and religious practices positively influenced the cultural growth of the Assyrian Empire. The population of the empire was divided into different social classes. Initially, the society consisted of free citizens, Mar Banu, dependent classes, and slaves. Later, a new class called Mushkenu emerged, consisting of freed slaves and exiled people who had bought their freedom. The Assyrian policy of deporting and relocating conquered peoples had created ethnic diversity across the empire. A large part of the Assyrian army was made up of foreign soldiers, and even some officers in the military command were non-Assyrian. The real unity of Assyria was centered on the figure of the king, who held absolute authority. The political instability and turmoil that followed the death of each king were proof that this unity depended solely on the ruler's power and control. In other words, unity was maintained through force and oppression. After securing his son Ashurbanipal's position as heir, Esarhaddon began teaching him about state affairs and foreign policy. When he was convinced that Ashurbanipal could handle the responsibilities of governance, Esarhaddon began preparing for the invasion of Egypt. At that time, Egypt was one of the richest countries in the world. Controlling Egypt would also stabilize Syria and Palestine, where frequent rebellions and unrest threatened Assyrian dominance. Pharaoh Taharqa anticipated the Assyrian attack. He sent agents to Palestine, encouraging the kingdoms of Tyre and Ashkelon to rebel against Assyrian rule. Taharqa's goal was to weaken the Assyrian army by forcing it to fight on multiple fronts. Esarhaddon began his campaign in 671 BC. He sent part of his army to punish Tyre and then marched through the Sinai Desert into Egypt. Egypt was not strong enough to resist the Assyrian invasion. Within a month, the Assyrian army had conquered Memphis, Thebes, and the entire region extending to the south. Egypt was divided into Assyrian provinces, with an Assyrian governor and a military commander appointed to each region. After the conquest, Esarhaddon assumed the title of King of the Kings of Upper Egypt, Lower Egypt, and Cush. Caravans transported Egypt's vast wealth to Nineveh. Control over Egyptian trade routes also gave the Assyrian Empire dominance over trade with Greece, the Aegean, and the western Anatolian ports. After returning to Nineveh, Esarhaddon faced uprisings in Egypt against the occupying Assyrian forces. 2 years later, he planned to personally lead a campaign to suppress the rebellions. However, in 669 BC, he died on the way. Ashurbanipal inherited a vast empire from his father, stretching from Egypt to Lake Van, from central Anatolia to the Persian Gulf. Cyprus in the Mediterranean was also part of the empire. Assyrian trade ships sailed between the Aegean and western Anatolian ports and the old Phoenician ports of Syria. The palaces and temples within the empire were filled with valuable goods sent from distant provinces and vassal kingdoms. Iron, tin, and silver came from Anatolia, gold and ivory from Egypt, precious stones from Iran and Bahrain, and cedar and myrtle trees from the forests of Lebanon. The gardens of the king, nobles, and wealthy citizens were filled with exotic animals and plants brought from various countries. Colorful fish swam in the palace ponds, creating a scene of luxury and abundance that reflected the wealth and power of the Assyrian Empire. After Esarhaddon's unexpected death, chaos erupted in the Assyrian palace. However, Queen Mother Nakia Zakutu supported her younger grandson, which led the other brothers and nobles in the palace to accept Ashurbanipal's coronation. Despite her old age, Queen Zakutu remained highly influential in the palace. Thanks to her influence, a possible civil war among Ashurbanipal and his brothers was prevented. After his coronation, Ashurbanipal installed his brother Shamash-shum-ukin on the Babylonian throne, as had been decided during their father's reign. Ashurbanipal spent the first 5 years of his reign putting down revolts in Egypt. Pharaoh Taharka had recaptured the Nile Delta and Memphis from the Assyrian forces. In response, Ashurbanipal sent a commander with an army to Memphis. The Egyptian forces under Taharka were no match for the Assyrians. After his defeat, Taharka fled by ship to Thebes. The Nile Delta was once again under Assyrian control. Local nobles who had joined the rebellion were taken to Nineveh and executed. The Assyrian occupation of Egypt lasted for about 16 years, until 655 BC, despite occasional minor uprisings. While Ashurbanipal was focused on Egypt and dealing with the kingdoms of Syria and Palestine, trouble began brewing in Anatolia. After destroying the Phrygian kingdom, the Cimmerians advanced toward western Anatolia. The kingdom of Lydia, founded around modern-day Izmir, came under threat from the Cimmerians. Gyges, who ascended the Lydian throne in 687 BC, struggled to fend off the Cimmerians. In 660 BC, Gyges sent envoys to Assyria, seeking help. However, since Lydia was not considered part of the Assyrian sphere of influence, Ashurbanipal refused to provide military aid. Ashurbanipal was more focused on securing the eastern borders. King Asheri of the Manai had seized a series of fortresses guarded by Assyrian garrisons. Ashurbanipal sent a trusted commander to confront the Manai. The Assyrian army besieged the capital, Izirtu, and captured one Manai city after another. When King Asheri was killed in battle, his son surrendered and pledged allegiance to Assyria. The Assyrians then suppressed an uprising among the Medes, punishing the rebel leaders by bringing them to Nineveh. During this period, Assyrian-Elamite relations remained peaceful. Ashurbanipal even sent wheat to Elam to help relieve famine and allowed displaced Elamite farmers to settle in Assyrian territory. However, the city-state of Susa remained hostile toward Assyria. When the Assyrian army was busy with campaigns in Egypt, rebellious tribes in the south received support from Susa. Ashurbanipal launched a campaign in the region, crushing the rebels and advancing as far as Susa. However, the Susian resistance proved difficult to suppress. By 655 BC, cracks began to appear within the empire. The new pharaoh Psamtik gathered his strength and successfully broke free from Assyrian control. Gyges, the Lydian king, supported Egypt by sending a naval fleet and soldiers. Ashurbanipal was forced to accept the loss of Egypt. What concerned Ashurbanipal more was the threat from Elam. In 653 BC, Elamite king Te-Uman launched an attack and occupied parts of southern Mesopotamia. Ashurbanipal personally led the Assyrian army against the Elamites. The two armies met in battle on the plains near Tel Tuba. At the end of the battle, the Elamites were defeated. The Elamite king and his son were killed on the battlefield. Elam was divided among the king's 3 surviving sons. The Gambela tribe, which had fought alongside the Elamites, was severely punished. Ashurbanipal was satisfied with suppressing the southern rebellions and defeating the Elamites. He appointed Nabu-bel-Shumate, a descendant of Marduk-apla-iddina, as governor of southern Mesopotamia, and placed an Assyrian guard unit and advisors under his command. However, despite the apparent success of the southern campaign, it exposed the deep weakness of the Assyrian state. The empire had expanded too far. making it difficult to control the various ethnic groups by force alone. While the army was putting down rebellions in southern Mesopotamia, uprisings were beginning in Anatolia. In cities like Ur, Uruk, and Nippur, resentment against Assyrian rule and oppression turned into outright hostility. These ancient cultural centers were surrounded by Assyrian garrisons, making them feel like prisons. Any sign of resistance was swiftly crushed by Assyrian soldiers. Babylon became the center of resistance against Assyrian rule. Ashurbanipal's brother, Shamash-shum-ukin, who ruled Babylon, was dissatisfied with the limited territory under his control. The cities of Babylon, Borsippa, Cutha, and Sippar, were not enough for him, and Ashurbanipal kept a close watch over these cities. In the spring of 652 BC, Shamash-shum-ukin openly rebelled against his brother. He sought to unite Egypt, the Syrian city-states, Arab tribes, and southern Mesopotamia in an alliance against Ashurbanipal. He distributed large amounts of gold, silver, and gifts to win support. Nabu-bel-shumate, the governor of southern Mesopotamia, and the Elamite kings, who owed their thrones to Ashurbanipal, sided with Shamash-shum-ukin. Ashurbanipal decided it was time to intervene. He stationed his army around Babylon and sent a general to the south. The Elamite army that came to support Babylon was easily defeated. Ashurbanipal then secretly supported a coup in Elam, which overthrew the Elamite king. For a time, Elam was ruled by pro-Assyrian kings. Meanwhile, the siege of Babylon and the surrounding cities continued. After a 3-year siege, Babylon fell in 648 BC. In the final moments, the defenders set the city on fire. Rather than being captured by his brother, Shamash-shum-ukin threw himself into the flames and died. The remaining Babylonian cities were quickly captured. The rebellions in Chaldea and around the Persian Gulf were also crushed. Babylon was rebuilt and placed under the control of an Assyrian noble who ruled as a governor rather than a king. In 647 BC, Ashurbanipal led his army into Elam. The Assyrians attacked Elam from 2 directions. One army advanced from the south and the other from Babylon. When the campaign ended, Elam's cities, including Susa, were completely destroyed. The population was enslaved and deported to Assyrian territory. The destruction of Elam forced neighboring states to submit. Cyrus, the king of Persia, sent tribute to Nineveh as a sign of loyalty. The only group left unpunished in Mesopotamia were the Arabs. During the Babylonian-Assyrian conflict, the Arabs had supported Shamash-shum-ukin. In addition, some Arab tribes from the Syrian desert had raided Assyrian settlements in Syria and Palestine. The governor of Damascus was tasked with punishing them. Assyrian forces swept through the desert, burning Bedouin tents and impaling the population. The king of Judah was deposed, and people exiled from Elam and Susa were settled in Samaria. Elam had been reduced to a wasteland, the Arabs were punished, and the centers of resistance in southern Mesopotamia were destroyed. Meanwhile, in Anatolia, the Sumerians had sacked and burned Sardis. After the death of Lydian king Gyges, his son Ardys ascended the throne and pledged loyalty to the Assyrians. The Sumerians, who attempted to march toward Cilicia after plundering the temple of Cybele in Ephesus, were defeated by a powerful Assyrian army in the region. The Sumerians, who remained nomadic and resisted permanent settlement, continued to cause unrest. Urartian king Rusa II sought to gain Ashurbanipal's favor and maintained good relations with the Assyrians to protect his kingdom from the Sumerians. During Ashurbanipal's reign, the Assyrian army fought continuously for over 30 years. Most of these wars were led by Assyrian commanders, but Ashurbanipal personally directed foreign policy and military strategy from his palace. Ashurbanipal was the most passionate hunter and sportsman among all the Assyrian kings. The walls of his palace were decorated with hunting scenes and carvings of lions and deer. The king himself was depicted in these carvings, reflecting his pride in his hunting skills. In addition to his military and hunting prowess, Ashurbanipal was an enlightened and cultured ruler. In one inscription, he described himself as follows: "I have mastered all the arts of writing brought to me by the wise Adapa. I have studied the signs of the heavens and the earth. I debate with scholars at assemblies and demonstrate the meaning of liver markings with the most experienced diviners. I can solve the most complex and hidden mathematical problems. I have read the most difficult Sumerian and Akkadian tablets. I have examined and studied the ancient columns written before the flood, which are almost impossible to understand." These words reflect Ashurbanipal's thirst for knowledge and the pride he took in his intellect. He was clearly one of the most educated rulers of his time. Evidence of Ashurbanipal's intellectual legacy can be seen in his vast library in Nineveh, where over 30,000 clay tablets have been discovered. This library contained state archives, including political treaties, trade documents, correspondence, and letters. It also held literary and scholarly works collected from across the empire, some of which were copied and preserved. The library included thousands of epic poems, hymns, prayers, and folk songs, as well as scientific texts on medicine, astronomy, mathematics, and geometry. This rich cultural legacy left by Ashurbanipal provides a window into the intellectual and cultural achievements of the Assyrian Empire. Ashurbanipal was also passionate about the visual arts. The reliefs in his palace reflect a new level of artistic detail in Assyrian art. The depiction of a wounded lion, a galloping horse, or an archer shooting an arrow shows that artists of Ashurbanipal's time had begun transitioning from abstract to realistic representation. Under Ashurbanipal, Assyrian relief and sculpture art moved toward a more realistic style. When Ashurbanipal died in 627 BC, he left behind a vast empire that he had ruled for 42 years. This empire stretched from central Anatolia to the Persian Gulf and from the eastern Mediterranean to the Iranian plateau. Ashurbanipal had two sons. The first, Ashur-etil-ilani, ascended the throne with the support of his tutor and chief general, Sin-Shum-Lishir. However, Ashur-etil-ilani was already gravely ill when he became king, and his reign lasted only a few months. After his death, the chief general Sin-Shum-Lishir held power for a brief period until Ashurbanipal's second son, Sin-Shar-Ishkun, was crowned king in a formal ceremony. In the same year, Kandalanu, the Assyrian governor of Babylon, died. Although the Assyrian military garrisons in Babylon and the surrounding cities initially recognized the rule of Ashur-etil-ilani and then Sin-Shar-Ishkun, the city of Babylon did not appoint a new king after Kandalanu's death. Babylon remained without a king for a year, which weakened royal authority in both Assyria and Babylon. Meanwhile, trouble was brewing in Anatolia. Between 630 and 620 BC, the Scythians, who had driven out the Cimmerians, invaded Syria, plundered the region, and marched to the gates of Jerusalem before continuing into Egypt. In southern Mesopotamia, the Arameans and Chaldeans began rebelling in the Persian Gulf region. For centuries, the Arameans of southern Mesopotamia had worshipped Marduk and Nabu. Babylon and Borsippa were the central centers of this worship. The Arameans fought to reclaim these cities and resisted Assyrian domination. As Assyrian oppression and exploitation intensified, the Arameans and Chaldeans began seeking political unity free from Assyrian control. Sharing the same language and religious beliefs, these groups sought to create a unified political entity where they could live without Assyrian interference. Land ownership was also a major issue. Most cultivated land was controlled by Assyrian landlords, and the Arameans worked as laborers under them. This sparked the beginnings of an early Aramean national identity movement, as the Arameans began to resist Assyrian dominance and sought to reclaim control over their own lands. After Ashurbanipal's death, a Chaldean noble named Nabopolassar took control of the Persian Gulf region. Sinshar-ishkun, the Assyrian king, initially recognized Nabopolassar's authority and independence. However, this recognition meant little to the ambitious Chaldean leader. Nabopolassar sought to take advantage of the political chaos in the Assyrian palace. Gathering his army and receiving support from the Elamites, Nabopolassar attacked and plundered Uruk, then marched toward Nippur. In response, Sinshar-ishkun ordered part of his army to lay siege to Babylon, while the rest of his forces were sent to confront Nabopolassar. Nabopolassar slowly retreated, drawing the Assyrian army toward Uruk, where he ambushed and defeated them. Meanwhile, the people of Babylon broke through the siege lines, attacking and scattering the Assyrian army. Just as the Babylonians had once crowned Marduk-apla-iddina, they now invited Nabopolassar to rule. In 626 BC, Nabopolassar was crowned king of Babylon in a grand ceremony. Although the Assyrian state was weakening, the Assyrian army remained loyal to the king. In the following years, Assyrian forces occasionally marched south to attack Babylon and its surroundings. During this period, the Medes had grown powerful and established a centralized government. In his histories, Herodotus describes how the Median king, Phraortes, marched on Nineveh and laid siege to the city. Thus, the balance of power began to shift in favor of the Babylonians. The weakening of royal authority and the failure of leadership further weakened the Assyrian kingdom, allowing Babylon to seize the initiative. By this time, the Babylonians were on the offensive, while the Assyrians could only defend themselves. In 616 BC, Babylonian forces crossed the Tigris and advanced northward, defeating an Assyrian unit sent to stop them and laying siege to the former capital, Ashur. A powerful Assyrian army eventually arrived to relieve the city and forced the Babylonians to retreat. However, the Assyrians were forced to turn back when they learned that the Medes were advancing on the city of Arapha. After the death of Phraortes, his son Cyaxares ascended to the throne. Cyaxares repelled the Cimmerians, driving them from the shores of the Caspian Sea into the interior of modern-day Russia. He then reorganized and modernized his army. In 614 BC, Cyaxares launched an attack on Assyria. The Medes first passed near Nineveh, crossed the Tigris, and laid siege to Ashur. The city could not withstand the fierce Median assault and surrendered. The Medes plundered, burned, and destroyed the city, massacring most of its population. Babylonian king Nabopolassar marched toward Ashur, but by the time he arrived, he found only smoking ruins. Afterward, the two kings, Nabopolassar and Cyaxares, signed a treaty of alliance, which was strengthened by the marriage of Nabopolassar's son to the daughter of the Median king. The destruction of the old capital weakened the foundations of the Assyrian state. but did not immediately bring about its collapse. After sacking Ashur, the Medes withdrew with their loot. In the following years, the Medes launched several raids into Assyria, but these were more like plundering expeditions than attempts at permanent conquest. This allowed the Assyrians time to regroup and prepare for future invasions. In 613 BC, the Assyrian army, led by King Sin-shar-ishkun, crossed the Euphrates and attacked the Babylonians in the south. The Babylonian army was defeated and forced to retreat. This was one of the last victories of a collapsing empire's weakened army. The end was near. In 612 BC, the Medes and Babylonians decided to unite their forces. The combined armies laid siege to Nineveh. The city resisted for 3 months. However, in August of the same year, Nineveh fell. King Sin-shar-ishkun died in battle while leading the city's defenses. The remnants of the Assyrian army retreated northward to the plains of Haran under the leadership of the king's chief advisor, Ashur-uballit II. While the Medes plundered the grand palaces of Nineveh, the Babylonians pursued the defeated Assyrian forces as far as Nisibis, modern Nusaybin. In the autumn of the same year, Ashur-uballit declared himself king of Assyria and crowned himself in Haran. Haran became the last stronghold of the Assyrian Empire. The following year, the Babylonian army decided to eliminate this last pocket of Assyrian resistance. Marching toward Nisibis, the Babylonians plundered the region and captured many Assyrian soldiers. By 610 BC, Ashur-uballit had managed to gather a new army. That same year, the combined armies of the Medes and Babylonians decided to march on Haran. Meanwhile, Ashur-uballit had requested reinforcements from the Pharaoh of Egypt. Egyptian forces arrived in time to support the Assyrians. The Assyrian and Egyptian forces withdrew from Haran and crossed to the western bank of the Euphrates. Haran was then plundered and occupied by the Medes and Babylonians. A few months later, the new Pharaoh Necho increased the number of troops sent to assist Ashur-uballit against the growing threat from the Medes and Babylonians. Encouraged by this support, Ashur-uballit crossed the Euphrates and laid siege to Haran. The siege lasted for 2 months, but the city did not fall. When Nabopolassar led reinforcements to support the defenders inside the city, the Babylonian forces launched a counterattack, scattering the Assyrian army. After this defeat, Ashur-uballit's name disappeared from historical records. He likely fled to Egypt, where he either died in exile or was killed by the pharaoh, who may have seen him as a political liability. What is certain is that after this event, the Assyrian state ceased to exist. It vanished from the political map, replaced by new states and empires. However, the Assyrian people did not disappear. They continued to live under the rule of various states in Mesopotamia, Anatolia, Syria, Palestine, Lebanon, and Iran. Over the centuries, they formed alliances and rivalries with neighboring peoples, preserving their cultural legacy to the present day. The warrior kings of Assyria expanded their empire relentlessly by burning and destroying the lands they conquered, placing many peoples under a harsh yoke. The Assyrian Empire was a slave-based state that relied on plunder and forced labor. The oppressed peoples had already begun organizing strong rebellions during the reign of Ashurbanipal. It was difficult for an empire with ever-expanding borders to protect its territory, while also suppressing a constant stream of internal uprisings. The Assyrian Empire had fulfilled its historical role. All it took for its downfall was the swing of Cyaxares' sword,